right, welcome to today's episode of the Insecure Agents podcast. We are at AI Engineer Code today. The focus of this conference is talking about coding agents as it applies to how AI engineers use them and develop them. These developers have had some recent troubles with MCP. MCP is the Model Context Protocol that Anthropic developed and published last November in 2024. So after this entire year, we've seen some skeptics come out for MCP as well as some defenders. So today we have Dex Horthy and Ian Livingstone here with us today to challenge MCP and defend. So Dex will be our challenger and Ian is our defender. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Amazing. So happy to be here with Dex.
This is very exciting.
Yeah.
I'm really glad this came together.
Me too.
I did not know I was going to be the MCP challenger, but I'm happy to do it. I'm ready. I got all my talking points loaded up.
Dex and I decided that we're going to be friends after this still, so it's all going to be good. All right, let's do it.
Let's do it. So MCP has been out for about a year now. In Anthropic's 2024 blog post announcing MCP, they said MCP's aim is to help frontier models produce better, more relevant responses. How is that going today?
I mean, if you think about where we were in 2024, right? You had ChatGPT, early versions of Claude. Claude Code wasn't, if I remember correctly, fully out at the time.
It was like 6 months before.
It was 6 months before, right, exactly. So there wasn't a way to bring any context from any other system into the model. So the experience of using ChatGPT or any of these like LLM apps were like either you went and built like a complex RAG store and you had to like pull all the data into the RAG store, put the vector store, but there was no way to do it like as a user, just bring some data from like Google Drive or anything else into these apps in a way that was standardized, uniform, and worked cross agent, right? And so from that perspective, today, I can build, if I'm a SaaS app or a developer, I can build an MCP server and expose a bunch of context from my specific thing into many of these agents, and it's available, right? So I think from that perspective, big leap improvement. So I think pretty successful at the base delta from where we were to where we are today.
Yeah, I think you bring up something about, you're talking about like, okay, before MCP, I kind of had to custom code all these tools. Basically, if I'm not an engineer, I can't add tools to my AI unless I'm going to pick it. Like you have to like write code and get LangGraph or CrewAI or any of these frameworks, plug them in, do the agent loop. Like if you can code, you're okay. But even then, I think one of the biggest mistakes people made in the early days of MCP, and they're probably still making it, but most people have figured this out, is like if you are building an agent, you should probably not use MCP. Like people thought MCP replaced SDKs, and you're just like, okay, instead of importing the Vercel client into my TypeScript app, I just use their MCP server instead. And I think that's like, you can do that. I don't think it gives you any benefit. I think the real benefit is like, if your users are non-technical, it allows anyone who's like technical enough to like write a little JSON file or paste in an MCP server URL, you can build your software as an MCP client, and then you can enable non-technical people to extend the functionality of your app without you having to custom implement all these integrations. And so I think that's really powerful, and I think like the more people plug into that and stop trying to use MCP in their custom-built agents, that was, I think, a big unlock for people that it took a while for people to pick up on, like that's the right way to do it. But
yeah, and I think part of the challenge is like if you think about tool calling in general, like computer use tools, like why did we start with, why did Anthropic invest money here? Like if we take a whole step back in the veil, both was going on at the same time. OpenAI was working on browsers, you had the OpenAI operator demo, and from a strategic positioning perspective, they had to bring something to the table that allowed them to have a relevant story about computer use tools. I think that the other aspect of this is, if you sit back and say, okay, well, why is it had been so hyped? Like, why are people talking about it? Because it's the first time where anything that wasn't Anthropic, OpenAI, Google Gemini, Microsoft, white labeling, OpenAI stuff, had a story where they can say, hey, we have a we can bring data and actionability into this new paradigm and create relevancy for our products and also unlock value for our end users. And those end users could have been developers or they could have been anyone, right? Like, why would I want to go and artisanally create some agentic loop if all I want to do is bring some data from like a Google Sheet into ChatGPT and query it, right? Like, I don't want to do it. And more importantly, if you're like a builder of one of these like API layers or one of these apps, you don't want to like artisanally create some API thing. You want to actually like implement some standard that the agents will understand. But there's a whole gap between like intention and what has happened and some of the downsides, which I'm sure Dex is going to be more than happy to sit and talk about.
Yeah, Yeah, no, that feeds great into my next question, which is essentially who is using MCP, who's getting value from it. YC is famous for saying build something people want, and when it comes to MCP, who really wants MCP, who's getting value from it? Is it enterprises trying to distribute their product to different LLMs, or is it end users that are using the MCP clients?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to a lot of enterprises that are like, hey, we're building a chatbot. And so again, this is the same point again. They're like, okay, so then we need to build this as an MCP server. If one team's building an AI agent, then all of our internal teams who are going to expose data to this AI agent are going to need to build their things as MCP servers. And they were a Java shop, and there's no MCP libraries in Java, so they ended up re-implementing the MCP SSE protocol in Java just to do a thing where I'm like, well, if you own both sides of the picture, I don't think you need MCP. I don't think it's worth. I mean, unless you're 100,000 person enterprise where you basically function as 50 separate companies, I still think it's overkill in a lot of cases.
That's right.
I don't know if that answers your question.
I think it does, and you also answered it earlier when you said non-technical users actually are getting value at MCP because they can connect tools that way.
Exactly. Yeah, I think people who can pull a bunch of MCPs in. I think there's a lot to be said for quality. I forget who was I read the post on Twitter today. I think it might have been Dax, but it was basically marketplaces are really exciting, but they have to be curated. And so you end up with MCP marketplaces that are 50,000 servers, and 7 of them are good, and the other 49,000 whatever are really bad. And then eventually the people who want to guarantee product quality take it off the marketplace and just serve it in-house instead, and then the marketplace is useless. So I'm not anti-MCP marketplace, but I would love to see better curation, because my experience in the first 6 months of MCP was I want to try a Gmail thing, or I want to try Google Docs or spreadsheet or whatever it is, and every single thing that you would try would just be this barely frickin' works. I don't know who made this. I really don't want to give them my OAuth keys. How do I make this better?
Yeah. I think those are all really, really fair points. I think I'll to address sort of linearly here. First and foremost, if you're an enterprise, you're not just thinking about agents I artisanally build. You're thinking about the things I buy and adopt as well, right? So, a lot of for Keycard, a lot of our customers, the reason they're building MCPs and they're building them at scale, it tends to be because they actually have bought a Claude Code or a Cursor, or they bought a ChatGPT, or some agent off the street that supports MCP, and they want an interoperability story where we build once, get lots of value, and MCP gives them an ability to advertise and expose functionality to these workflows in a way that's different than traditional APIs, and also has promise around things like federation, support, discoverability. Not entirely there yet, but that's sort of the reason. So if you talk to them, that's the justification.
Well, and I think there's the lock-in side of that too, right? If both sides of the equation are interchangeable, the tools and the actual agentic software, you can swap any of them out, and you're not locked into these coupled systems.
Bingo. So I think that's actually one of the if you think with the enterprise, when they think about buying software or deploying software, they're really looking for how do we give ourselves the most optionality, and how do we bet on things that enable us holistically across the thing. They really want the punch once standardization, so that they have one place where they can deal with security challenges, they have one place where they can deal with governance challenges and auditing challenges, but also one thing that they can sort of just be hey, developers, you want to build an agent or expose something to an agent? Here's the answer. It's not perfect, but it's a better answer than everyone doing 1,000 different things and none of it working together.
Okay.
And I think that's true within the enterprise, and it's also true between companies and across companies in the enterprise.
So your answer might be, there's no way to prevent this in the enterprise, but how do you keep this from becoming a Spring WebSphere situation where you have this monolithic middle layer that does everything and way too much, and it actually becomes calcified in the enterprise, and it makes things slower over time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the first part of what you originally said, why? I think the second part you talked about was really about discoverability and quality, right?
Okay.
There is a fundamental issue, which is we have this in open source in general, and on the web, right? Because it's we want a world where anyone can create anything and put it out there, but also it's really hard, especially with MCPs, especially where the MCP started, to be is this thing good or is it bad? Is it secure? Is it not? In truth, because of where Anthropic started and what they started with, what they started with wasn't very good, and it was designed for something very different than what people actually are adopting and using it for.
Well, yeah, it was a land grab, right? You had prompts and responses and all these things, and the only thing people really needed was tools, but I think Anthropic was okay, cool. We might as well just take as much as we can, and then if whatever catches on, we get. And it's you have a bunch of weird extra protocol bits sitting on a thing where it's okay, it's not loss leader, but it's like this thing drags the rest of the protocol along with it, and some clients are implementing certain things and some are others. Like, would you be an advocate for like an MCP 2.0 that dropped a lot of capabilities, or do you think those need to be in there?
I think we, in a way, kind of have that with the current versioning scheme. Like, you could have a versioning scheme, like the next release could be like, and we're dropping support for local MCP, right? Like, maybe they decide to do that. It might actually be better for everyone if they did drop local support, and I think that's a question we should talk about. Or maybe they want to drop like SSE, right? Like, so I think there's things that they want that they will. We have a mechanism with the versioning standard where they could do that, and we already have protocol negotiation and versioning negotiation built into the standard, so we have the capacity to do that. And I mean, I think a lot of like what we're talking about with MCP reminds me of like OAuth 1.0 versus OAuth 2.0. Like, for those that don't know, OAuth 1.0 was a security nightmare and an absolute travesty.
It was really hard to implement, too.
Really hard to implement.
All this HMAC signing, and yeah.
It was wild. And like, not to say that OAuth 2 is like this amazing protocol. It's not. But it is certainly like leagues better and more secure if you include the right extensions. And it's also enabled user federation across apps on the web for the last decade. And that's fundamentally changed, like been a better outcome for everybody. And so, you know, with protocols, it's sort of like, it's never going to be great, but ideally it's not awful. And I think like OAuth, for lack of like better or worse, I think we're better off having it than not. And I think MCP, at the end of the day, and we'll get into it, but I think at the end of the day, like, its original intention and what's turned into, I think is a lot of the original vision and intention is still there, but it's going to take time to evolve the protocol into a thing that actually makes sense for everybody as we better understand what agentic workflows even look like, right?
Yeah, it's a great point for sure. And speaking of how many times this protocol has changed, there's been about like 3 different auth mechanisms added over the course of the last year, and multiple different versions of the auth spec. So now they're supporting dynamic client registration, pre-registration, and a new one called CIMD, which is OAuth client ID metadata documents. Have we finally figured out auth for MCP? Like, have we fixed it?
Oh, I get this answer. We've made it much better, right? Like, I think thinking about OAuth in general, like dynamic client registration has a huge amount of problems with it. Like, it's basically unauthorized, right? It's unauthenticated, and the fact that the only reason it works is because there's a delegation involved where at least I know it's Dex or Ian that is trying to catch my OAuth server, but like in terms of the client, it's kind of like, who cares, right? Like, there's no proof point. You know, client ID metadata solves a huge amount of this problem.
Yeah, so this is the thing where they put like the URL to the server is the client ID?
Exactly.
Okay, tell me why that's so much better.
Well, because it gives you an ability to like basically create an identity. And that identity is both secured via like the OIDC metadata document that's available, so you have a bunch of information. It also gets rid of client ID secrets, right? So you don't have to copy around and store a bunch of client ID secrets, because we're actually moving from a symmetric key-based, like, you know, like, here's a hash, prove the hash, they match, to a PKI-based system, where in that OIDC metadata document, you're actually publishing keys.
You can just put a JOT in your thing, and then as long as the server has your public key, then you can, I mean, okay, so here's
that's a like, broadly for everybody, that is a big security improvement, and it's then back to TLS, which is why the URL matters, right? Because we can build on top of the things that made the web federated, like the federated secure web possible.
Like owning like
exactly.
Domains.
If you own the domain, you trust the DNS, you trust the certificate, primary certificate issuer, then you're building on things that already work, and so it solves a lot of the problems associated with agents that can be like addressed via HTTP, but it doesn't solve agents that aren't available over like HTTP or the web in general.
What mechanisms are in place today? Because obviously we have the same problem with like authorization headers in HTTP. What is in place to prevent the like chaos that sometimes emerges when you have stringly typed, where literally the entire structure is just a string? Anyone can put anything they want in there. Like, how do you avoid the like proliferation of a million different ways to do the same thing?
I would love an answer to that, right? Like, I think ultimately this is where standards begin to fall apart more than anything. They tend to be directional, and it's like back to just like ignoring client metadata, but like OAuth is a good example where people sort of all follow the spec, but if you build any OAuth server at scale that's interoperating with other OAuth servers, you know, actually everyone has done this weirdly slightly different. There tend to be common patterns, but there's not perfect implementations, and that is something agents actually can help us with, unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
It would be great if like there was JSON schema for everything and strict validation, but on the flip side, I think, and I've had a lot of conversations with my co-founder Jared about this, unfortunately with strict validation, when you go to evolve the clients and the servers, you actually create a lot of interoperability problems. And there's this, exactly, so there's this trade-off between like, do we just remove the strictness and just like try and evolve the standard in a way that we understand that like not going to break, it's always backwards compatible because we just drop all the strict typing and just like kind of assume the clients figure out? Or is it the inversion where we include like a lot of versioning inside the standard and a lot to solve all of these different use cases? I think the truth of it is because of how long it takes the IETF and others to like get like a spec basically to something that's like accepted is the limiting factor here.
Yeah, that's true. While we wait on the spec to have updates and maybe we fix the protocol, there's things that people are doing today to potentially secure MCP. Because there's a lot of security vulnerabilities out there today that are related to MCP, including rug pulls, tool poisoning, cross-server tool shadowing. One of these came to light recently in a Trail of Bits article that they published where a tool poisoning, a bad tool description essentially came into the agent and asked the agent to export the entire chat history in the name of SOC 2 compliance, and because the model knows enough about security to know what SOC 2 is, but not enough to know exactly what SOC 2 is, decides to export the entire chat history too.
And just upload it to some attacker's URL or something?
Yeah, exactly. So, definitely a lot that needs to go on to secure MCP, and unfortunately it's in the hands of developers to mitigate this. Yep. So is MCP just a huge security liability, or does MCP potentially offer us a location to insert auth checks at the network layer, so maybe it's a security advantage?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, have you read Simon's post on like the lethal trifecta, right? Of
yes.
like the things that make MCP unsafe is what? It's like access to like private data.
Yeah.
Like feeding in untrusted input, like MCPs off the internet, or like fetch results
and
off the website.
And untrusted output too.
Huh?
And also you can technically be untrusted output, right? Because like the thing that the MCP is talking to could actually be talking to something that's untrusted. Because MCP is basically a man in the middle.
Interesting.
Right, and like that's where you get that's a variation of tool poisoning attack, where it's like the output that comes back from the tool actually then goes to the context and poisons the context window and then changes the behavior of the agent.
Yeah, so I mean, I spent a lot of time building human-in-the-loop systems because my take was always like, if you want to get agents to do anything useful, you should probably like give them access to tools that do things that matter. Like, but when it comes to like modifying data or sending emails on my behalf or querying large parts of the database, like I want to approve it. And there's a whole async thing of like, if you're not sitting there staring at the chat window, how do you actually mechanically do that over the network? But the other side for me was like, if I have a browser agent or something running out in the world somewhere, and it's going to, I mean, browser agents exist because most websites don't have APIs, and the good ones even have like OAuth. But essentially, like any agent that wants to do something like swipe a card on my behalf, I mean, you can think of like what I think of as like state of the art in like what is it called, rich authorization basically. So like we don't have that yet. We have fine grain auth in something like GitHub where like you have tons and tons of granular permissions, but even with kind of like what I would consider close to state of the art, all you get is like you can only merge PRs, that's the only thing you can do, and you can merge it on only this repo. And for me, that's like nowhere near tight enough. Like I want, when the agent wants to do something that matters, I want to get a notification on my computer or my phone that says, and I basically sign a key that says you can merge this pull request on this repo for the next 30 seconds, otherwise you have to ask me again. And I'm like waiting to see something like that in MCP. I think that would make it a lot more useful to actually let people be comfortable having out-of-band, outer-loop agents have access to do meaningful things and access to meaningful data.
I think that's spot on. And I think that's true not just for MCP, but it's true for the web in general, right? And like agents, you know, like we didn't have to do this previously because it was always a human. And so as long as you could authenticate that the person doing the thing was a human, so that there was a button, clicking the button, or a human wrote the code, right? That a human was involved and we're just going to trust their judgment. And now we have this thing that likes to hallucinate or do lots of crazy stuff once in a while.
Or trust weird instructions that someone sent you in a support ticket or something.
Exactly. We're moving from this world of like super deterministic human-driven workflows to this world of systems of action that are making decisions and reasoning on our behalf. And our identity and access systems are totally broken. So everything about the Dex just said is 100% correct. It is an issue that manifests in MCP because of how we think about MCP and where it sits in our mind in terms of like enabling agents to do actions, but it's not actually an MCP issue. it is an OAuth issue to the extent that like OAuth doesn't support a proper standards. Like, how would you present this type of workflow today?
Isn't there like the rich authorization paper that is like per action request?
Yeah, there's some idea, but it's not standardized, and there's very, very limited support for those types of concepts. But I mean, certainly that's the world we need to get to, to actually enable like any form of like human in the loop autonomous like agents that are equivalent to like a self-driving car.
So you're saying this isn't even an MCP issue. This is a LLMs issue because now we're working with non-deterministic software.
It's driven by LLMs. Yeah, LLM, independent of whether it's MCP or not. Like, if we wanted to realize the promise of what these things can do and how they change like the way we interact with software, it doesn't matter if it's MCP, we're using fucking OpenAPI documents, or we're using SOAP, right? Like, we're still going to have this fundamental, like, as a user, I want to like explicitly be able to write a policy that's a subsection on a per task basis of what I'm allowed to do, and I only want to like assign that to this identity, and I want it like cryptographically secured, so the downstream authorizer, like the GitHub MCP or GitHub API can be like, oh, so this agent is agent X, I can validate that. It comes from user Y, I can validate that. And only once this authorization policy applied, cool, I can do that. We have no way to do it today.
And I have user Y's public key, and I can see that they signed the request. I mean, I think a lot about, like, this is similar to how, like, Apple Pay works, right? Where you get these, like, short-lived cards that are only good for one, or maybe not Apple Pay, but a lot of, like, you get these ad hoc credit card numbers that are only good for 5 minutes, and they're only good up to $100 and things like this.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's some beginnings, like you can see in commerce, where commerce is trying to begin solving this problem, right? Where they're like, if you go look at a lot of commerce standards, it's like, how do I get like a fake card ID effectively that's like a representative of like a credit card that's like that I can delegate to some identity, and it has like a max spending limit of $50, right?
Right.
And that's their first initial take at like, how do we do this? But there is not broad, good understanding of how it is going to work at all. But there's a lot of good thinking. There's things like biscuits and verifiable credentials. There's a bridge off stuff you mentioned. So it's coming. It's just that is unfortunately very far out on the curve of stuff today. If we think about like what people are trying to do today, it's sort of I want to connect some data into my agent, and I want the agent to be relatively accurate, and maybe it can take action on my behalf, and it also doesn't like take my PII data and shove it to the browser and give it to Google or something, right? Like that's like, unfortunately, that's a layer of like security challenges we have to deal with just to get like people to step one of the process. Yeah.
That makes sense. So at least it sounds like there's some hope, but there's definitely some issues with MCP today that users are reporting, especially developers. MCP servers can come with hundreds of different tools. Not all of them are necessarily relevant, and when you have more tools, it makes the agent harder to decide which tool is correct to use. There's also this problem where tool responses can fill up the context window, so lots of context engineering is needed on the developers perhaps to make MCP really work properly. Also, they have to manage things like we talked about before, like implementing auth. That's optional. The spec doesn't even require that. They also have to deal with all of these MCP security vulnerabilities that we just talked about. So while MCP might be great and the best protocol we have today, per se, there's still a lot of work that the end user, the developer, has to do to make it work properly. Is that fair? And given that, can we still call it a good protocol?
I mean, the classic example, this one's not even like fun anymore, but this idea of like the GitHub MCP, if you don't filter the tools, it's 60,000 tokens or something, when you could just use the GitHub CLI, which is already in the training set, right? And so like if you're using any coding-based agent, which like you're talking to GitHub, you're probably building software with that. But you look at the GitHub like MCP, it's actually designed that you only opt into the set of tools that you want. Like it has a bunch of flags, but nobody reads the docs. So it's like, as tool designers, as MCP designers, I think it's really important to be very like careful with, like, this is a problem we can solve with good design, I think. Like it's a little bit on the developer to be aware of, hey, check your context window and see how many MCP token, how much of your window is being taken by, and I'm talking about this a lot tomorrow, of like the smart zone versus the dumb zone, we like to call it, which is like, if you're over 40% context used for most tasks, you're going to get a severe degradation in performance past that point, unless you like have a perfect trajectory and you're like really like manicuring every single step of the workflow. So it's a little bit on developers to make sure that you're maximizing your time in the smart zone of the coding model or the coding agent. But you look at a server like, I love Context 7. Context 7 by Upstash is not just like the responses come back in Markdown, which is very succinct. There's no JSON. It's literally just plain text that comes back. But also, they let the model request how many tokens. And so there's like a model on the back end that says, goes and reads all the docs. And then based on the size of the response, it gives back, and so you have even progressive disclosure where the model can say, okay, cool, like that was 5,000 tokens, that wasn't enough, give me the next 5,000 tokens, or give me the 10,000 token version because I don't have what I want. And so it's like, I don't know, this is an MCP problem, but it's also just because MCP is so easy to use and you can just install a bunch of local stuff. I think it ends up, we've given a lot of people like a massive foot gun, and I'm curious how like you think we can solve that.
I think this is like the most relevant, like honest, like reason to be disenfranchised with the current MCP ecosystem, and I actually don't put it on end users at all, or even agent builders to a certain extent. I think we're missing a middleware layer, right? If you think about it, I mean, we started with a spec that basically said just where what people did is they took OpenAPI and they just ripped it into a shit ton of tools, right? And there was a reason that like MCP actually like beginning was, well, we actually needed, it was RPC based. We need to invert, like agents can't think in terms of taking a bunch of APIs together, turning to a workflow, and then running it sequentially in a way that like is deterministic, that you would expect from a user asking an agent to take an action. And so we ended up with this like thing with RPC based so that you could be like, well, actually it's an inversion of control from the way we used to design APIs. We actually want RPC, so instead of being like, add this thing, add this thing, add this thing, add this thing, check out, it's like, hey, I'm buying this thing, check out, right? And that's a one call that can be done in one loop, request response, instead of like asynchronous workflows that or data that's built over time. Now that's an API design problem. Now the thing we're talking about is a tool bloat problem, which is, well, really, if you think about what an agent, let's say take a Claude code is in the context window that you're managing, and Dex knows way much more about context engineering than I do, but you know, why would that, in that context, why would that agent ever need all of those tools? But that doesn't make MCP bad. What it does make certainly is there's a missing layer, which is there's tools, then there's the tool discovery negotiation layer, which says based on the task that we've asked for this thing, what tool should this thing actually know about, or do we call, right? And that like so that there needs to be a management as a part of the harness. There needs to be a management layer between endless tool bloat, right? Like what is the like basically we're at the point where it's like, hey, context window, have the entire universe of possible things you could do in every call. Like obviously that's not a good idea, you know, based on the way that any of these work. So we need something else. And I think the criticism I think that's maybe appropriate is to say we're missing a best practice from, say, an Anthropic or from the model context protocol ecosystem. They have started to present one with the way that they, the idea of like using code to generate code tools as a sort of a middle ground there.
Well, and that's also cool, right? Because you don't have to pass the responses through the context.
Exactly.
The model can take the response of this and send it to this, and I don't want to see it. I just want to like execute this pipeline.
Well, why exactly? So why would you want any of that data or any of that stuff? And also, like, why would you ever want to expose any, like, whether or not you're doing like dynamic ephemeral credentials like what Keycard does, or you're actually just using API keys, like why in the world would you ever want to expose an API key or any type of sensitive data directly into the context window, right? There's definitely like a harness, and you want some of that you want that harness, and tool calling is differentiate from there's content, what's in the context window, what ends up there, and then there's the layers around all of that. And I think if we were to step back and kind of think of this as a multi-agent system, one of the multi-agent systems underneath all of the sub-agents is the tool calling layer, and then tool discovery, and then selection of those things and management of it, for sure. And I think we're just missing it.
I'm going to say this, Ian, because I love you. Please don't ever say multi-agent system again.
Okay, you got it.
No, I'm mostly joking.
Yeah,
but there are a lot of times I hear people say multi-agent system, and I immediately assume you have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so there's a nuance there, and like, when you say multi-agent system, what do you mean? Like, what are you talking about under the hood?
Yeah, I mean, like if you think under the hood, that tool calling layer just talked. There's going to be a level of non-determinism there, obviously, right? And so we step back and say, well, there's multiple layers of LLMs being applied to solve this problem. Let's think about like the boxes here. Each box with an LLM, you could call it an agent, right? Like,
so this is like treating an agent basically as a tool, and it's just like anything else. So whether your MCP server or your other type of tool has an LLM behind it or not, from the main agent's point of view and from the design of the system, it's just agents and tools.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. You need exactly. And there's been discussions like even before MCP there was, unfortunately, a Gorilla actually, Gorilla GPT. There were like ideas of models that just specialize on tool discovery and tool calling.
Oh, yeah.
That focused on solving this problem, right? Of like, well, how do we figure out what tools to use?
What do you think about these systems that like do like a vector search against 1,000 tools and just pick one and give it back to the model?
I mean, it's
or pick 5.
I mean, let's assume they were, if they're good, right? Like, and I think that's the problem, right? Because it comes down to how good are they for the task at hand. The same way, like, and how in distribution is whatever it is that we're doing is in the distribution of those tooling models, right? And I think, like, in truth, like, if let's say there was a world where there's a lot of that data, then they could be very good. Now, do we have a ton of that data today? I don't know of a massive data set that has that data today, and that's part of the challenge here.
For sure. Yeah, I feel like with tool calls, the more tool calls we have, like there's a potential where the LLMs could get trained on that, so they might get better at it, so we might not need things like code execution. So do you think that will notably improve MCP if we start to train on that?
I don't know. I don't like using the training data for knowledge ever. I like to think of LLMs as like, think of a person who has lived 10,000 years. They have seen and read every single thing in existence, but unless you activate those memories, they're going to have a really hard time learning about that stuff. And so I'm always biased towards, like, if you want really good results, just take everything about your problem and make sure it's in the context window versus like waiting for the models to have enough information to be able to I mean, maybe it'll happen someday, but like waiting for the models to good enough to one-shot things without additional context feels like it's good. It might be a while.
I'm actually curious, Dax. I would love your perspective on this. David Kramer at Sentry has built a new Sentry agent MCP.
Yep.
And he's a thought leader in our industry. And
it's been really fun watching his journey on Twitter about like the first thing they tried and the next thing they tried. Yep. And then what was the final answer was basically like, we actually built an MCP that has an agent behind it, and
yes.
the only input is the main agent calls it with natural language, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And what's your view on that as a solution to some of these problems we just talked about? Like, when we say multi-agent, there is an agent behind that Sentry, and if you're using Cloud Code and use that, so I'm not picking on your dislike of the word multi-agent, but like that is a system of interaction with multiple agents involved.
Yeah.
And like, so I'm curious, like, what do you think of that approach, and do you think that helps improve some of the problems we talked about? Because when I look at it, I say it's not perfect, but it's certainly better than what we had.
Yeah.
And it also begins to allow Sentry to present a level of intelligence that's unique to Sentry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not actually against the idea of multi-agent systems, but exactly what you just said is like a much better thing to say. It's like, oh, cool, there's a main agent and it calls tools, and the tools take natural language as their inputs, and on the back end there's an LLM and it's connected to all the Sentry APIs. Like, I know it's more to say, but if you can say multi-agent system, but you can't say that second thing, then it's like, okay, you need to like be more clear about what you're describing, because I'm going to talk about this tomorrow. We have a lot in AI, worse than any other industry before, of this thing that, like, Martin Fowler came up with this in like 2006. He calls it semantic diffusion, which is basically like, you have a term that has a good meaning and it's useful, and then it gets out in the world and everyone starts using it, and suddenly the word itself is completely useless, and it doesn't mean anything because it means 100 things to 100 different people.
I mean, zero trust insecurity is the same thing. What does zero trust mean? It means nothing now. It used to mean something very specific. Now it means absolutely nothing, because every vendor, and same with AI, right? Like, what does AI mean? Nobody actually knows.
What is an agent? I don't know.
Yeah, MCP is not the only protocol out there today. There's actually lots of them that have come up between 2024 and now. There's an article on Archive called Different AI Agent Protocols, and it was published in June. And basically they break down these protocols into inter-agent protocols and then context-oriented protocols. There's actually a lot in the inter-agent protocol category, like A2A and ANP. Within the context-oriented category, there's really only two that they list. It's MCP and agents.json. The difference between the two is agents.json is stateless, but MCP is stateful. What does that mean for how unique MCP really is? And is the stateful component to MCP something that sets MCP apart from all the other protocols?
I mean, I'm curious to hear, you work with more people doing MCP in the enterprise. Like, I have had experiences with MCP clients that don't really support the stateful part of it, where they're relaunching the server every time they want to make a call. And I'm curious what you've seen in terms of, like, are people actually using the stateful parts of MCP? Because I know it adds a lot of weight on the client side as far as like life cycling these things, right?
Yeah, I think I think we should like talk about I have many opinions. So let me break this down in a structured way that at least can get all the thoughts out of my head. So I think one thing I will say is what I'm seeing, and A2A is interesting, and certainly like the original thing that Google pushed around A2A, and then what they have today is like what was very close to like a Google thing, right? Like when A2A first came out, you look like Google designed this. This looks like everything I'd ever seen from Google.
Very clean code.
Very clean code, but it looks like Borg, not Kubernetes, right? If we were to like make, or it looks really a lot like TensorFlow, not PyTorch, right?
Right.
And PyTorch obviously became much more popular than TensorFlow because it's easier to use. Same thing with Kubernetes versus Borg. So 8A has come down, and what 8A looks like a lot more like today is a competitive protocol to MCP in terms of discovery of agents. And if you kind of look at what MCP is doing from its like agent, its cards, a lot of like the metadata they're adding to MCP, it feels like what's actually happening is you're seeing this convergence between MCP started as tool calling, 8A and friends started as like, how do I discover agents? Actually, I think what we're seeing in the Century MCP we just talked about is like an example of these two things are converging, and there probably isn't a massive difference. Now, from my company's perspective, like we'll support both. It doesn't matter. We're like kind of agnostic to this whole specific debate. But I think at the end of the day, on the stateful versus stateless side, agents.json, and there are a cohort of architects, like people who have not spent a lot of time doing what Dex does every day, who are just like, well, isn't this all just like open API or like, SOAP or some other?
Just the LLM is turning natural language into JSON over and over and over again. Why does it matter what the like transport looks like?
It doesn't, right? And so the problem with some of these experiences, like stateful or stateless, I think there's a tug and a pull in the ecosystem between people who very much understand and realize the value of the future of agents, which is going to be, and the unique thing being, what that agent can do is completely dependent upon the prompt and the context and data and actionabilities access to, and that's different. You change any of that, and it can do new tasks it couldn't have done before, right? And that's where the statefulness is important, right? Its state and content engineering is inherently a stateful process. There's state associated with that's at the core of how all of this works. And so when we think about agents.json versus MCP, and I think about like the A2A versus MCP dynamic, I'm sort of sitting here being like, look, agents.json is an enriched version of OpenAPI. That is a way to advertise things with some extra metadata that a thing could consume and then turn into an agentic operation. I think if all you want to do is advertise a bunch of static APIs that may be RPCs, maybe OpenAPI and agents.json or some version of that is sufficient. But if you think about the future where tools and agents, it becomes disintermediate. Like what is an agent or what is a tool is almost like, it's almost like relativity in the sense that like my perspective of what's a tool versus my perspective of what's an agent is completely dependent upon the use. It's like I'm using another thing, well that's a tool to me. But that other thing may actually be an agent because there's an LLM everywhere. And if we step back and we think about like the transition that software is going through, we're going from a world where like there is no, almost no non-determinism in our software to a world where like non-determinism is everywhere and it's like the core feature and the thing that makes all of this useful and awesome. And so at the end of the day, like I think all these differentiations don't actually matter, and we're going to end up in a position where the statefulness is what drives the adoption, it's what drives the unlock, and it's also what results in an experience on the web that is inherently agentic versus inherently driven for humans, right? Like, and we're at the very beginnings of that transition period.
Yeah, and there was this big explosion when like REST APIs became very in vogue, whereas like, every single website needs a REST API. Yeah. Most of them got it, but like REST APIs are for developers. Yeah. There's 47 million developers in the world. How many, or was it 47 million? I don't know the number. It's on that order, right?
It's large now.
Yeah.
But there's going to be billions of agents. And so we may actually see more MCP and A2A than we see REST APIs being adopted because there's a bigger market for people to consume these things.
For sure, like every person could have like 10 agents or 100 agents or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, as long as you don't call it a multi-agent system.
The
other thing I wanted to add is like the coolest thing about A2A for me when I was comparing A2A and MCP, because they both all work on the same underlying, like an A2A client is the same as an MCP client where you go discover what's available and then you tell the LLM, here's the tools you have available, right? At the core in the model layer, it doesn't change. What was really cool to me about A2A, especially because we were working a lot on human-in-the-loop systems, and when an agent wants to call a tool, and then you want to go like page someone on Slack, and then if 5 minutes later they don't respond, you page someone else on Slack and like get the approval back in. well, you can't really build a production grade system if that state of that request is sitting on the call stack somewhere, because your server crashes, you come back up. And so like A2A did this really cool thing, and like the most common use case I heard people using A2A for was actually using humans on the other side of the A2A protocol, and basically having an A2A client call that agent, but it was actually going to a person, and then using the asynchronous nature, which is something that MCP is like trying to figure out now, but it's like, how can a MCP client fire off a request and then get notified later that it was done and keep doing other work in the background? A2A had that built in from day one, which is one of the things like, okay, this is really well thought out along certain dimensions that MCP is going to take a long time to get to.
Totally. I think that's completely fair. Good. It's a really important observation. And I think actually if you look at the web, talk about REST APIs, a lot of people know how to what does a good REST API look like, because you maybe have used Stripe, right? Like you kind of get the idea. They're primitives, it's kind of flat, I can post and I create, I don't have super high nested hierarchies, and we use some type of open API to document the thing, and now you have a REST API that most developers can consume. The problem is most apps in the world are actually static. They're basically CRUD, right? They're not asynchronous. They're one call, it's done, request response.
Right, the client is maintaining, that was the whole thing of REST,
Exactly.
the client maintains the state.
Yeah.
It's not totally true, right? Because you go look up the session in a session store on the back end and things like this, but...
Well, the other thing is in computing, there's always state. It's a question of who owns it, right?
Yeah.
And in REST, it's or in modern web design, it's the state lives in the client or the browser or in the thing that's doing it, or is being stored, so there's always state someplace. The other component of it is that most apps are never asynchronous, right? So you go and think about what are design patterns for building asynchronous workflow APIs, right? That are stateful, where what you have is a piece of data that represents actually, hey, I asked you to go do something that's going to take a long time. It could take 10 hours, 70 hours, 100 hours, 250 hours. 10 months from now to happen. There's not good convergence, unfortunately, on what those look like. There's some ideas like async API out there, but there's not wide adoption of this stuff. And agents, because of things like human in the loop, and because of the long length of time it can take to think and plan and do deep research, are inherently asynchronous. And importantly, the transition in UI UX we're going through, right, is removing from a world of synchronous human computer to, hey computer, here's my intent. Go interpret it, come up with a plan. I trust you.
Don't send the email until I approve it, though.
Yeah, but don't send but maybe send it, because maybe I trust you enough that you send it, right? And that's a trust equation, and that evolves over time as the agents get better. But to your point, maybe don't send it until I've approved it, because I don't trust you. And maybe that's the right decision for you and that agent in the context of what you asked it to do.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. So coming back to the stateful versus stateful, it's apps are changing, workflows are changing, asynchronous workflows are at the core of the future of computing and how we interact with computers, and we need a good mechanism for how we manage that, and it should be standardized so that it's easy for agents and developers to build those kinds of applications, and also for us to have a prolific web and a prolific computing experience that can deal with all the different long-tail tasks we have out there.
We've been chasing it for a long time.
We have
one protocol to rule them all that makes everybody's life easier.
Exactly.
Once every 10 years we get something. It happened with cloud a little bit. It happened with Kubernetes a lot. Hopefully we get it in MCP someday.
Maybe it's MCP. The one thing I will say is I do think there's a lot of reason for MCP to find success. And there's a lot of reason why it has so much hype and people still talk about it, is because it actually is solving some itch someplace.
That's true. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where MCP is at in a year from now. So maybe we'll have to do this again in a year. Will MCP still be around or not? I'm pretty sure it is, thanks to this conversation. But yeah, if there's nothing else either of you would add, I think that's a wrap. Thank you so much for...
This was fun. Are we still friends?
Fun. Oh,
yeah.
I think we're better friends now.